Yeah. Thanks for coming out tonight. First of all, can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. We got a little bit of, well, Paul's taking care of that. Anyway, I look through the crowd here and I see, a lot of people my age, older, younger, but about my age. And, before even, when I was young, if you found something like this was kind of unique. Plastic. Well, it's ubiquitous today, okay? And you can find paper bags everywhere you go, okay? Corrugated cardboard, no problem. Seen that forever. And you got pasteboard baskets. But if you turn back the clock, back to the mid-19th century, none of this stuff existed. But people still had to move, carry things around, work with things, and wood was the primary material for construction. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is a wood factory, a wood manufacturing factory, the Hibbard Basket Works. And I title this A Personal History because of my family's relationship to the factory. I never saw the factory. I heard about the factory from my father, from others, but the factory has always been part of my life. So, personal history. The Hibbard Basket Works is located in South Butler, New York. There you go. Yeah. Plug for South Butler. Okay. Yeah. And, I know we're in Cuyahoga County, and, this is a Cuyahoga County facility. But South Butler is just across the Cuyahoga County line, almost within spitting distance. So I guess that's why they let me in. Okay. South Butler, for being kind of a small crossroads to me, has some pretty substantial history. Okay. In 1841, I had the first black pastor to speak to a white congregation. 1853, the first female minister to be ordained in the United States. Okay. In 1898, there was a patent granted for a cash recorder, which became the basis for the National Cash Register Company, evolved. Okay. And what we're going to be talking about tonight, is the second largest basket factory in the United States that existed in this little town. I'm fine if people would, if it'd make it easier to view this, turn the lights off? Yes. Yeah, okay. Good, I'm in the dark, you can't see me. Okay. So, a little bit about the ownership of the basket factory. It was founded by a fellow named Jerome Hibbard. We'll talk about him a little bit. In 1867. He died in 1888, and it was inherited by his son, Fremont Hibbard. Okay. And then it was purchased by a fellow named George Akins in 1932. And then in 1935, it was winding down its operations, and we'll talk about that a little bit. In early 1940s, the remaining artifacts, many of which now reside here in the museum, were moved to the Akins family farm just outside of Savannah, and were stored there for about 30 years. And then in 1972, when that farm was auctioned off, my father convinced me to spend $25 at the auction and buy the remnants, which we then stored on our family farm just outside of Savannah in 1972 until most recently. Oopsie. This is Jerome Hibbard, the founder of the Hibbard Basket Works. He had many accomplishments. He was a carpenter, amateur photographer. He studied as a physician and served in the Civil War as an assistant surgeon. He even had a practice up in Fairhaven for a few years. And then something happened. It's not quite clear what, but he abandoned that profession, moved on to something else. He's been called a mechanical genius. He invented a farm gate, which got a U.S. patent. And he also got a patent for a basket making machine, funny thing. And he also designed and created all the necessary equipment for the basket works. And there's a lot. It's a lot. Okay. So that's his portrait. Okay, no, we want to do. Okay. So this is a photograph outside the Basket Works taken in the 1880s. This fellow circled here is supposedly Jerome Hibbard with part of the crew. Okay. The other fellow who is circled here is his son, Fremont Hibbard. Okay. And if you remember, Fremont inherited the basket factory operation in 1888 when Jerome died. Okay. Okay. Here's another picture of Fremont Hibbard with crew. This is probably in the early 1900s. There's not a lot of good dates. This isn't a very good picture, but it serves a purpose for me tonight because there's a lot of names here. Everyone in this photo has been identified. Okay. So Fremont Hibbard is here. Then you see these 4 red circles. They correspond to the 4 red names down below here, and each of them is an Akins. South Butler was very thick with Akins in the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And so that's became part of the Hibbard Basket Works was very much part of the Akins family lore. Okay? And one of these fellows here, this one fellow circled here, is Nathaniel Akins. Okay? And he was George Akins' father. So upon, in 1932, I don't have a good photograph of Fremont other than those, and I don't have very good photographs of George Akins either. This is kind of a close-up of him taken in the 1940s. And this is another family shot here taken in 1943. Obviously, World War II. George's son here is obviously the feature in this. He became a bomber pilot. He flew B-17s over Europe in World War II. But this is George. And then in the background here is my grandfather, Floyd Cotton Sr., my grandmother, Louise Akins Cotton, George's sister, okay? My father, Floyd Cotton Jr., and then I'm not certain who that person is there, I think, and I don't know the name of the dog. Okay. So anyway, the family, the Akins family, George probably purchased this because he saw this as possibly a business opportunity. Maybe it motivated him because of the family relationship. But anyway, he purchased the Basket Works in 1932. Okay. Now, to do my relatives a greater service, here's a slightly better picture of my grandfather and my grandmother. This is a graduation picture when my father would have graduated from high school, and kind of give you an image of what he would have looked like when he was growing up. And his father, Floyd Sr., was working at the basket factory in the 1930s. And this young man, 12, 13, 14 years old, would have this place to go to. And I don't know what you were like when 12 or 13 or 14, but that was very attractive. I mean, here you had this big, this facility, a lot of mechanical things, whirring, spinning, great place for a young boy. And I made an impression upon him. Okay. And this is George's widow, Ruth Akins Finch. And she, I'll talk a little bit more about her. She also served to continue the history and the legacy in the family and passed it down to me and others. Let's see. Like I said, my grandfather worked in the basket factory. My grandmother actually did piecework for the basket factory, making picnic basket covers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too. So, there's some employment here. And remember, this was the Depression times. So everyone was working on what we call today a side hustle. Anything you could do to make money, to put, they did it to survive. Okay. The other thing I want to point out, this shot was taken on the Cotton family farm. There's a building in the background here. I'm just going to point that out now. You'll see that building again towards the end of the presentation. So anyway, that's kind of the Akins-Cotton connection. And so as I was growing up, listening to this fine lady talk, listening to this young man talk, and a little bit from, there was always something in the background about the basket factory. It was almost became mythology for me. So, okay. Here's another picture of Ruth Finch in 1973. See, she had maintained a lot of artifacts, baskets from the basket factory, and was giving a presentation about it. Okay. And there's also, in this picture, there's a whistle here. That's a steam whistle from the basket factory. That's now been donated to the museum, the Butler Historical Preservation Museum over in South Butler. So again, through some keeping some baskets, keeping some artifacts, talking, that's the family lore that's been passed down. Okay, more family lore. This is a hand-drawn sketch that my father did for me, showing the how the layout of the factory in the crossroads town of South Butler. So here you've got a north-south road, which is now Route 89, and then a crossroad here, which is the Spring Lake Road, heading over towards Cayuga County. Okay, and this outline here was about the 2 acres that encompassed the property for the Hibbard Basket Works right in beautiful downtown South Butler. Okay? So there are 4 primary buildings. There's the main building, which was 3 stories, and then what they call the splint, chopper, and handle room here, and then a basket weaving room, 2-story building here, larger building, also known as the tack house. And then there was a catwalk from the 2nd floor of the tack house to a storage barn close to the Butler Spring Lake Road here. So everything was connected here, and it evolved in such a way to be very efficient. So there's a flow of material. From logs could be brought in the road here, and then, as Lori Schmidt likes to talk about, the Butler Railroad, a rail track for the log cart running on it would bring the logs down here. They'd be moved, shipped, and then eventually brought down to a sawmill located in the corner of the main building.
Steve?
Yes?
I just remember what OH stands for.
Okay, we're talking about this building here. Yes, it is.
Oddfellows Hall.
Oddfellows Hall.
Yep.
Yeah.
Are you sure that's what it is?
Yep.
Okay, because that's why I suggested to you. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't some funky misinformation feeding back around here, that's all. Okay. Anyway, so my father, he wanted to pass down that information. So he drew this and a description of what on each of these buildings. So moving on, what I'm going to do now for the purpose of presentation and clarity, I'm going to take this sketch that he drew, and I've made it kind of a schematic, made it bare bones, because I want to use this schematic to kind of give you a perspective of what some of the images you're going to see later on. I don't know about you, but if I just see a picture and I don't put it in a context, it loses something. So I'm going to use this diagram here to give you some context. Okay? So looking back in time, okay, yeah, we've seen this picture before. This is the 1880s photograph of the crew with Jerome and Fremont out front. And as an example here, this picture was taken looking right at this part of the main building. And that's what the red arrow was supposed to indicate, the perspective of the photographer. So, so this was right outside the sawmill area, which is probably just over a little bit to the left in this picture. Okay, so that's the purpose of the schematic. Okay, so let's look at some other photographs. Okay, there was a series. A photographer came to South Butler back in 1909 and took a series of postcard photographs. And so that's what these are, basically postcards that you see here. So this is a picture of the main building for the Hibbard Basket Works. There's a bridge here which crosses Butler Creek. We'll see that a little bit better. So here's the perspective of the photographer. A couple of interesting points here I want to make while we're looking at this shot. This was a church, by the way, not in the background, but in 1880, Jerome Hibbard has just received a new steam engine for the basket factory built in Baldwinsville. So 1880. And then in 1883, the square 3-story section of Hibbard's basket factory is in construction now. So this main building was apparently constructed in 1883. Okay? Oh, don't do that. Do this. This is another view primarily of Butler Creek. And looking here, Butler Creek is important because it served as a water supply for the basket factory. The basket factory had a steam engine and a boiler, and they had to generate a lot of steam because they needed steam to soften the wood and make it pliable so it could be bent into shape and formed into shape. So they needed a fairly reliable water supply. They actually built the factory over the creek. And so that's what's represented here by this blue line, obviously. Okay? So that was photographed from 1909. Another 1909 postcard photograph here. This is obviously the 3-story main building. You can see a little bit of the steam room back here. And then the 2-story building there is the tack house or basket assembly area. And you can see the pile of slab wood here, a couple big logs. There's some sawdust here outside the sawmill. And so a lot of activity in 1909. Okay? And then I want to take a close-up here. I tried to make this same shot a little bit larger. Because if you remember the steam whistle from a few slides back, I think that's it right up there. Because it's right above the steam, the boiler and everything was in the far side of the main building. So it makes sense. But you can barely make it out there. If you're sitting in the far room, just take the far back part of the room. There's a little dot there that could be the steam whistle. Okay? So, again, pretty active in 1909. Okay? Okay? Moving on a little bit later, I don't have names for any of these individuals. This is 1920s. I was thinking maybe my grandfather might be in one of these individuals, but I don't really see anyone there that would resemble him. This shot was taken right here in this corner. So this building in back here is the tack house, the assembly building. And then, so you see this kind of a serious, very serious bunch. Okay? And they all have hats. And you think, and the other thing I noticed is that the mustaches were very much in vogue in the early 1920s. So anyway, the basket factory at its heyday employed as many as 100 people. Okay, so it was a major source of employment, and of course there was obviously would have been people supplying wood, and so it was a focal point of the community. When Jerome Hibbard died in 1888, there was a great outpouring of affection and celebration of his life, and at that time. So he was obviously a very important person in the community, just because of what he did in terms of industry and business. Okay. So what I want to do now is talk about the process of making baskets at the Hibbard Basket Works. Okay. So what I'm doing now, and what happened in each, in general terms, what happened in each of the buildings. So we're going to be talking about the main building here. So the logs would be brought in, and the wood, the preferable wood was elm. Elm was ideal for basket making for two reasons. One, had a very straight grain, okay? And two, it was very durable, tough wood. And the Hibbard baskets, Hibbard prided himself on having a durable, lasting, reusable product. It was part of his, part of what he did to sell the baskets. And so elm wood was, the wood for this application. So once they got the logs in the log yard, then they would saw the logs into dimensional lumber, and that was kind of two different. They would have bigger planks of the proper width that they would then use to make the splints. The splints are these wider, thinner parts of a basket. Okay, and then they would have they would cut smaller material blanks like the one I'm handling here. And I'm going to give, if you want to pass this around on this side and this around on this side. These are handle blanks, or these are handles that have been processed. Okay, I'll talk about the processing of them in a little bit. But there are several different smaller pieces. You had the slats, which would, not on this basket, but could reinforce the bottom of the basket. You had hoops. That's the circular part that goes around and binds the basket. And so this round basket has, 2 layers of hoops, and you had hoops on the inside, on the outside, I should say, and on the inside as well to hold tacks. And then you had handles, obviously. For most baskets had handles. And what you're passing around right now is a handle for the smaller baskets. And then shims, sometimes you had to have spacers in some of the baskets, so the smaller pieces became that. And so then on the second floor, once you had those smaller pieces, they'd be run through a planer, they'd be cut to shape. And so if you notice on the sample you got here, it's kind of beveled at each end. You may have noticed there was a hole drilled in the end of it. And then that was run through a planer. And there are 2 planers now here residing in the O'Hara Museum. One's on a wood frame, and one is a very heavy, I'm sure Paul can attest to that, metal planer. And so, obviously, if you want to have a basket handle, you want to have it smooth, not rough, because this is where you're handling it. And so they would have to, process, smooth all of these materials that went in the basket and make them so you didn't have, elm splints getting in, slivers getting in people's hands, for instance, okay? So the first floor was primarily the sawmill, and the second floor was processing. And what's missing from this?
The shaping.
Well, there's a floor missing, right? There's a third floor?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. The third floor was where they manufactured and maintained and did all the work to make these basket forms and repair the basket forms or any other of the materials that they had, because they made their own equipment. You couldn't go out on eBay and buy this stuff. And so Jerome Hibbard designed and built and had built all of the basket forms, all the equipment that you can see on display out here, and the third floor had lathes. They didn't have a blacksmith shop or anything like that, but they had means of fabricating in wood and light metal, the repair things that they needed to keep the factory going. Okay, so that was the main building. And then if you move to the splint and handle room processes, this is where they were right next to the boiler. So they were using steam, and they would steam the components at that point. So remember we had the planks. The planks were 4, 6, 8, feet long, because you needed the length to wrap around things. Okay? And what they would do, they would take these elm planks and steam them till they're soft and pliable. Then they had a big, long chop, like a big, long knife, that would come down and slice the elm into very thin splints. Okay? And that's where the straight grain really was an advantage, because then you could get the very thin splints they needed to make the bulk of the baskets. So that was what they did with the planks. Then they would take these flat, these stiff handles, they would steam them, and they would bend them and put them on forms like this and let them dry. And once they dried, then you had handles. And they would store those handles on these frames so they wouldn't spring back too much. Okay? So, if you're making baskets, you need a lot of handles. Obviously, you can't get a lot of those blanks. You might get as many as 3 on this one form, but then you got to put this somewhere until it dries. So, and then each different type of basket may require a different shape handle. So, a lot of the material that has been saved over the years are these handle forms. And again, the O'Hara Museum has a number of these shapes here of the different handle forms. So you see them. This one happens to be populated to show you what. There are others that are going to be unpopulated. In other words, no wooden blanks in there. So then the handles were steamed and bent and then stored in that area. Okay, and then that split and handle room was right next door to the assembly building. And that's where the action took place to make the baskets. Okay? The round baskets were made primarily on the first floor because the equipment for that was heavier and more massive. Okay? And there's an example of a press frame that now is here in the, and it's a roughly square frame with a lot of custom-built, mechanisms that enabled one man to stand in a position and do just about all the tasks, just from working one position and advancing, rotating it by operating with his feet. Then he could, have both hands free to continue a weaving process, tack things together, and create a basket. And each of the people who work here was a craftsman in his own right, but he was working on a standardized basis. So if you made a round basket and you made a round basket, they might be a little bit different, but they'd all be the same size. So, and uniformity is obviously, consistent uniformity was obviously of great value if you're going to try to sell these things. Okay? So each location, then, each basket weaving location had its own steam, had its a source of steam where they would get, the splints, they get the hoops, and they could, refresh the steam, make them pliable again, so then they could work with them and bend them around the forms, so they weren't, were pliable. So they take the splints, the very wide, thin pieces, and weave them on a layout board, start them. And so this is a layout board for a smaller round basket. And it's flat, and then what you see here are pins. And then so the splints would be laid between the pins. And so you get, like that. Then you fasten them in the middle, and that'd be the way you'd start the basket. And then this is an example of a round basket frame. And what would happen then is once you had the splints on the layout board, then you would take that assembled mass of splints and you put it on this frame and bend it around the form. Meanwhile, prior to that, on the form, you would have fixed inner hoops that was necessary. So this is a rectangular basket form, okay? So on this instance, you would only have one inner hoop up here at the top. So you would have the softened inner hoop, and if you want to come up later, there are little metal tabs here. You'd slide the wood up here underneath it and hold it in place. And then you would take the woven part of the of the splints, you would put them up here and then use a vise, and this would come up and push the splints up around the form, and the weaving process would continue. And you notice there's a post here. This was all designed so you could rotate it. And so a fellow could stand here and weave and tack and weave and tack and weave and tack and be very efficient. So that's kind of the general process. Then once you got you'd tack the outer hoops to the inner hoops. You take the basket, you'd pull this away, take the basket shape off, and then there was something called an anvil stand, so if there was other reinforcement that had to be done to the basket, they'd put that on it, and then you'd be able to tack, say, reinforcements to the bottom. So it depended on the type of baskets. They'd trim off the excess from the basket edges around here, and then if they needed to attach a handle, done. On to the next. So it was a very, set up so people could be very efficient. Of course, it took a little bit of training, a little bit of practice, but they were very productive. They were skilled craftsmen working in a uniform manner. Okay? And then, obviously, once they got the baskets assembled, then they would take them up here and store them for shipment. Okay? So just an example, visual example. This is the bottom side of a layout board. You can see it's a number 1 basket. They had them all labeled. You can see they used a Dymo marker to do that. No, they didn't. Anyway, but this was the layout boards were put on a pedestal, and so a fellow could stand here and then rotate as he was weaving. Again, he didn't have to move around it. So things are ergonomically designed. Maybe not be the safest things in the world in the world to work, but they were ergonomically designed. And then this is an example of a stand. This is a form that's on a stand. This is the compression plate that would come up and move the woven material around the form. This arm here is pivoted, and there's a foot pedal here, so you could press this up against the form just by stepping on a pedal down here. Again, a lot of thought went into how to make this process efficient and productive. Thank you, Jerome Hibbard. Okay, so there's a lot of larger artifacts. There are a number of smaller artifacts. I grew up with this tack hammer. This tack hammer was in the kitchen where I grew up ever since the day one. I can remember this. This came, a short-handled tack hammer. Don't need a long handle. Okay, custom design for. Okay. These are plates that would go in the bottom of the largest round baskets for reinforcement, to reinforce that weave here at the very bottom. Okay. These are a couple of product lines. This one's dated 1889. They're date 1887 on this one. Remember, Jerome Hibbard started the Basket Works in 1887. Sorry, 1867. I misspoke. 1867. And so this is part of the O'Hara collection now. We're going to use this as an example. We'll go through this in a second. But if this date that's written on here is the date that this was actually published, this would have been for the first year that they actually did a lot of marketing, commercial marketing of baskets from the Hibbard Basket Works. Okay. A couple other smaller items here. Some of this resides over in Butler now. Some of here. This is a list of 3x5 cards that list all the components down to the approximate number of tacks that would go for each basket. That's how closely this was, the process was monitored. And that's the way they generated a cost estimate. Okay. This is a steam boiler operator's catechism. The handbook that somebody wrote on how to operate a steam boiler. Okay. There are documents in here that belong to Nathaniel Akins. So that's a linkage there. Okay. These are some hardware. These are picnic basket cover clasps. You'll see those in a minute or two. This was another little notebook that had components for the baskets. And this was a weekly time book from 1935 that shows what could be the last shifts, the last paid shifts that worked in the Hibbard Basket Works. And my grandfather was on the payroll for that. Okay? So I want to focus on this item, the price list, 1867 price list. Okay? This is a cover. Inside, think about you're starting to get, generate your business. You can't read it. I'll just read a little bit for you. To the trade. In offering our goods to the trade, we make quality the first consideration for your patronage. How's that for a pitch? Okay? Don't hear that too often today. Our stave bushel basket with a saucer-shaped bottom. Remember those reinforced? Okay. See cut page 1. You'll see page 1 in a moment. Is superior to all other stave bushel baskets on the market. Proud statement. And our long experience and greatly improved facilities for manufacturing baskets make us feel confident that we can offer our goods at the same quality as low as any firm on the market. Okay? That's their pitch. It was fairly successful pitch. Second largest basket factory in the United States eventually. Okay? And then this is the very last page, and there's some handwriting here. There's a code up here, R equals 0, 0 equals 1, C equals 2, 1 equals J. I'm not exactly what that means. This is probably something that this Robert McAmmon put in for shorthand. I only mention that because you're going to see on the following pages of the product line of 1867, we're assuming, that there's going to be some of these scribblings by Robert McAmmon on there, and I just want to get the question out. Well, what are those out of the way? Get the question, what are those scribblings? I don't know. Okay? So I've answered your question before you've asked it. Okay. 1867. Look at the quality of the photographs. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So right off the front here, the round baskets. Okay. And they, several sizes. What you need to notice here is that the costs for everything are per dozen. They didn't have walk-in trade. They were mass production. They were selling to people who needed these things in quantity, or would sell them individually, but bought them in quantity. So you've got round baskets here. Then you've got what they call the diamond market baskets. It's a diamond weave pattern. So if you had a layout board, you'd be interweaving the splints in a diamond pattern. Okay. So several sizes there. If we go to the next pair of pages, then you take that and you put covers on some of them. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then you've got the diamond, and then you get to something they call the splint baskets, which are rectangular weave. Okay. Again, multiple sizes, some with handles. They called something a grocer basket that didn't have handles. Maybe they're just for display purposes or something in a grocery store. Okay. And then the final pages, then we get to something a little bit larger, laundry baskets. Okay, and then and here's some reinforcement that you can see on the bottom of that, because you're going to be putting it down, picking it up, moving it around, built to last. That was Then if you want to get really fancy, then they had these satchels, which have a rounded cover on them, and those would nest one inside another, kind of like Russian dolls type of things. Pretty clever, okay? And then clothing baskets. And you notice the handles on these are, kind of short at each end, integrated into the weave, okay? So if you go through this whole 1867 price list and you look at the different varieties here, some have covered variants, others don't. There were, total of 31 different products that they were selling or marketing in 1867. Okay? Okay. I mentioned earlier that my grandmother would do piecework in her home, making making the covers for the baskets. I call them picnic basket covers because that's how we used those baskets when I was young. So this is a table that's headed for eventually for the museum in Butler. It's still in storage at the moment. It was supposed to come out of storage, but some pesky yellow jackets made a nest in that drawer, and I really didn't want to try to run away from them in the storage area. Anyway, so this is a layout table. There's a form here. The flat, these were generally flat or slightly rounded, so they didn't need to be terribly pliable, so you could probably weave them without steaming, okay? And then, so this would be an example. I don't know if this is the table my grandmother used, probably not, but it'd be similar. So the basket factory not only did things at the factory itself, but they, put out piecework into the community. Again, during, people were trying to make, money any way they could, especially during the Depression years. So, okay. The reason, there's a hole in this table here, and then one of the artifacts that's here now is this pair of shears. It's like big, pruning shears, it looks like. But you notice one is a wooden handle here, but then there is a bent portion here. Well, that portion here, I'm not saying it for this particular, but that would have been, that elbow would have gone into that hole there. And so someone could be manipulating here and trimming off, moving it around and trimming off the excess splints to finish the basket. So I'm not saying that this necessarily went with that, but I wanted to give you the concept. Again, think about, rather than, how do I do this? Well, I need one hand here and then one, okay. Make the table be one of your hands. Okay, clever. Okay. Okay. So, yeah, look familiar? Okay, maybe you have some. So, so these are some of the splint market covered bands. You'll notice there's two different styles of tops here. If you've got a fixed handle in the middle, then the hinges are in the middle and fold up on the side on each end. This has a long hinge point here, and so these handles here, they're about the right size and dimensions to go around that basket. So those rotating handles rotate down, then you open up the big. So these were probably later, innovations, modifications, variants for the standard Hibbard baskets after 1867. Okay. Round half bushel baskets, the diamond market. So there are examples of these here now. Okay. As I say, I grew up with some of these. You notice this is kind of stained here in the middle in that one. Well, that's what happens when you pick up black walnuts and put them in the basket. Okay, just letting you know. Okay, another postcard type picture here. I would say this is probably about the same vintage as the other postcard pictures you saw. Let's call it 1900, early 1900s. Okay, and so this is a shipment. I think they're half bushel baskets. Okay, what they would do, I believe this is probably taken outside the finished basket storage area. Look in this direction down Butler Spring Lake Road. Okay, they would take these baskets down to the New York Central Railroad in Savannah and ship them from there. Okay, obviously baskets aren't very heavy, so you can pile them up pretty high, and you don't need a heavy wagon frame. I counted approximately 300 baskets are visible in the photograph, and you're only seeing one side. And so there's probably upwards of, say, 600-700 baskets. Okay, so you've got people making this size basket and generating 700 of them uniformly, so they all stack together. So skilled craftsmen making uniform product individually, and kind of not even, well, I won't call it an assembly line process because they did it all in one station. But the material flow to them was pretty efficient. Okay. So if any of you want to buy anything for the Hibbard Basket Works, there's copies of this order form in the foyer. Of course, you're not in the 1920s anymore. So, okay. Unfortunately, time worked against the Hibbard Basket Works. Okay. As I mentioned, there was that time book I showed on one of the previous slides. Okay. There was an entry in that on August 3rd. That was the last entry in 1935 that showed about half a dozen men had worked, how many hours they'd worked that day, and that was the last entry, and there were other pages behind that. So that may have been the last day of paid operation. I don't know that for a fact, but it's a one point in time. As I said, my grandfather, Floyd Cotton Sr., was one of the people that was listed there. Okay? Okay. I found an entry in one of my father's diaries on August 14th, 1935, that they were still operating the sawmill for some purposes. And he went down there and played in the sawdust, he said, and then he went up and cleaned around the lathe on the third floor of the main building. So by sometime in the late 1930s, I don't know exactly when, but maybe 1935, operation had ceased and the factory was basically abandoned. And then all buildings were torn down, soon after World War II. Why didn't the basket factory continue? Well, you can imagine a number of good reasons. First of all, you're dealing with the Depression economy. Okay, that of course it seemed to work, through the Depression. Dutch elm disease was on the rise. Again, elm was the preferred material, and suddenly, if your source of material is starting to become limited, that's a constraint. Aging and inefficient infrastructure. Remember from one of the previous slides that boiler or the steam engine was installed in, 1880? 1935, that's 55 years later. Probably tough to get parts, tough to keep, the operation of that equipment, was difficult, aging equipment, okay? And then you had competing new technologies. You had fully mechanical means of making wooden baskets. And then you started having corrugated cardboard. And then you started having paper products. Competition that didn't exist when it was developed. Everything started back in 1867. Okay. So, I've got some photos here. These are undated, unfortunately, but I've put some approximate dates. This is kind of an elevated shot of a lot of the basket factory acreage. And so there was, at this corner here, there is still two-story hotel. Two-story. I think this shot may have been taken from like the second floor of the hotel, because you're looking down and across, you can see. So I point out, here's the main building. The smokestack here is still standing. All the other buildings are standing. You can see the elevated pathway leading from the tack house up to the storage building. Everything seems to be pretty much intact in this photograph. Okay. Then we go to a slightly later view. Again, things are pretty much intact, but notice the smokestack here. It's collapsed. Okay. But and you can see things are starting to grow up, as happens. Okay. And now we've got a winter shot here. I don't know, again, early 40s possibly. No way of knowing for sure. You can see the collapsed smokestack. And you notice what's missing here. The tack house is gone. Okay. So, and with all the foliage gone and the snow on the ground, you get a pretty good perspective of what's missing. Okay. So what became some of that stuff? Well, if you remember way back when there was a picture of my grandparents, and by the way, the little fellow that was my grandmother's holding, you're looking at him now. Okay. So I grew up with, this. This is the building I pointed out to you in the back. And this is the same building today, but this was 1953. And you see these, first of all, this building was moved to the farm in 1917 as a tobacco shed. I don't know if you're familiar with the tobacco proofs, but basically it's pretty much open on the inside, and then there were louvered panels where you open it up and you get draft through. They would bring up the tobacco, hang the tobacco, let it dry, and then they take it down, bundle it up, and ship it off. Well, tobacco, this building's been repurposed numerous times since then. Sometime before 1953, this area of the building was repurposed as a chicken coop. Okay? And these windows that were put in for the chicken coop came from the basket factory. Okay? So some of the things were repurposed. Okay? And this most recent shot, and this is where all the equipment had been stored for about the last 50 years. On a second floor is put in here. You don't see those windows because they're covered with aluminum sheet just to keep the weather out. So anyway, by the way, this is my sister. You saw her. My grandfather was holding her, and this is one of George Aiken's grandsons in that photograph. And just in case you were wondering, okay. Something else. When I was growing up, there was another barn you can't see here that needed a bridgeway leading from road level over a gap up to a second level of a barn. And supporting the planks across that were these rails. So these rails connected a stone foundation to the side of the building. Planks were laid across that. Then rails were put on, this type of rail was put on top of the hold in place, and then you could back up loads of things to the second story of the barn. I always wondered where that rail came, because it's kind of a light gauge. It's not something you would find on the New York Central, for instance. And I had relatives that worked on the New York Central. And a lot of things from New York Central kind of migrated back to the farm somehow. Anyway, but probably not rail. And then it wasn't until my dad made that sketch and showed the rail system that things started to click and say that would be about the right weight rail for that log rail system. And no doubt when they needed to reinforce or come up with a better way of reinforcing that bridgeway, let's use some of the rail. And so that still exists today. And Lori Schmidt over here is drooling about the possibility of at least getting small pieces of that for her museum in Butler. So, as I mentioned, I grew up with, some tools that, came from the basket factory, parts and pieces. There was, as I mentioned to Lori, I don't have a picture of it now because it's gone, but I remember a watering trough that we had for cattle. And what it was a cast iron or an iron, looked like tank that had been cut in half. Was that part of the basket factory? I bet you it was. Because people were very resourceful. Back then, if there was something you could use and make additional use of, especially if you lived on a farm, you did that. Okay. So anyway, I kind of grew up with this for a number of different reasons. And therefore, I want to thanking these guys for helping you acquire this stuff and keep this alive. And I want to thank Jeremiah Butler, who owns the property where things are stored. Have been stored in that barn you saw down here. He's given us unfettered access to get the stuff out, so that's great. Lori Howland is a trustee of the Butler Preservation Society. She helped move stuff over here. That was helpful. Lori Schmidt, who's in the audience today, inspirational, keeps me honest. And thanks to Tim and the staff here for taking this on. I've looked for probably a better part of 20, 30 years for a home for this stuff. Here it is. Thank you.
We'll turn on the lights.
Yeah.
I'm sure Steve can answer some questions if you have any, right, Steve?
Oh yeah, happy to. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. I really don't know, but I suspect that they had all the materials at their stand and station. They had all the things. I imagine maybe 10, 15 minutes tops, because it was set up so they could just stand or even sit in one place and do everything and not have to move around. If you look at some of the stands where they did the assembly, on some of them there's a big metal strap that kind of runs this tag that would hold things upright, so you just reach out and grab it. And then there are cross bucks available that have maybe next to each stand where they could have material, and so everything was pretty much within reach. And I don't know, I imagine they were probably paid by the hour, but maybe they're paid by the piece. And if you're paid by the piece, that's, yeah. So, yes, in the back, yes.
I'm wondering, did they make these per orders that they got in, or did they make a lot and send them out to retail places, and how much did they cost?
Well, okay, let me consult the Bible here. Everything was per dozen, and so they didn't have a retail outlet like you'd think. So they were looking for large volume sales. They had a sales force that went around equipped with these and would get orders. And then you saw the order form here. So they would collect the order forms, bring them in, and then produce per order. Because they didn't have a lot of storage, if you notice there. So it was mostly temporary storage. They would get an order in. Let's say they had an order for those half-bushel baskets that were on you saw on the wagon. Okay? So maybe that order came in, and they said, okay, guys, we've got to create 700 half-bushel baskets. Probably the entire, or most of the effort in the basket factory was focused on fulfilling that order. From the time the logs came into the saw, they would saw the planks to the right length, so they get the right length splints, and then everything that they needed for that order would have been built per order. And then if you wanted to buy a half bushel basket like this, and again, what we're assuming is 1867, no guarantees, the half bushel basket with a swing bale, you could buy a dozen of those for $4.75. That according to, okay. If you wanted to buy a bushel basket that didn't have a swing, that just had two fixed handles on either side, that would set you back $5.25. Okay, for a dozen. Okay.
So
Okay.
where was the biggest, or the largest basket maker in America?
Somewhere in Massachusetts. I don't remember the name, but Massachusetts. Okay. Other questions? Another question.
Yes, those plates, and you said they put them in the bottom of the baskets for reinforcing.
Yes.
How did they just lay them in there, or were they connected somehow?
Okay. When you made a circular basket, you would lay it out, and all of the splints would intersect at the very bottom of the basket. Okay? And so at that point of intersection, they would put down one of those plates and then rivet all of the splints so around that point, and then they could rotate them, space them out, bend them up, and then weave these others to that. So, other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did they have a contest to see how big of baskets they could make ever?
I don't think so. I've never heard anything like that. And see, every time you made a basket in this basket, you would need a form. And so if you're going to make a big basket, you need to make a big form. Now, that being said, do you know what a pack basket is? Something you put on your back and you carry stuff. My father told me that in the later years, when my great uncle George was running the factory, they made an attempt to make pack baskets. And in the storage area, there are a couple of forms for baskets, and they're about this tall, they're rectangular, about this tall and about this big around. And that's the biggest form that I've ever seen. But using this process, it's, you needed to have something to build your basket around. Okay? So, and then there was a slightly smaller version of that same thing. So those may have been the forms that they experimented with. Again, trying to, find a new market. Okay? Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did they use local elm trees?
Oh, yes.
All local.
Well, have you ever handled a log? You don't want to drag those, you're not going to bring those in from Massachusetts. So yes, I remember when I was growing up, there were still elm trees. In fact, in South Butler, the streets were lined with elm trees. Yes. And so they were fairly common, back in the 1800s. And so I'm sure there were local farmers that maybe clearing their fields, or they made it, so someone would come in, cut the trees, and they would sell those logs to the basket factory. But I'm sure they didn't come from very far away. I almost guarantee that. So.
Do you know how far, like countrywide, or did they go sell into Canada, or do you know how far they sold their product?
I really don't know that. I know that they would go down to New York City, and I've heard that talked about. I suspect they were fairly regional. I was going to say the Northeast, maybe over in Ohio a little bit. But I really don't know the scope of their business. My knowledge is fairly limited to South Butler. Something I get my head around. Okay. Anybody else? So my recommendation is, I've talked about a lot of things. I'm going to leave a copy of this presentation for the museum, and then the museum graciously donated like a 12 by 12 area where a lot of the appliances, a lot of the equipment that has been saved over the past, well, let's see, call it 1935 to 1925, last 80 years. Examples of that are now in your museum, and I thank you for donating a space for that so that history could be preserved. And so,
Thanks, Steve, because he just took away what I was gonna say.
yeah,
We have a huge display down there that he has graciously offered, and it's just still being put together, so there's really, once Tim gets himself back organized here, because Steve just dropped off some more stuff over in the other part that I'm not sure how it's gonna be all put together yet, but time will tell.
Yeah.
It's here,
Yeah.
it's in the museum.
yeah. They may be having an auction at some point. You might.
I think, what a heck of a job, you know, this was amazing, how much information we have.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Believe me, we got tons of refreshments, and Cindy has a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Are these stamped with the logo or are they?
No.
Or anything like this? So if you ran across in somebody's barn a basket, you wouldn't know for sure if it was.
No, I think the best way you'd know is by looking at what it's made from. So, if it's got a lot of straight grain in it, it's elm. I know there are a couple baskets that look like they're made from red oak that we donate. And so they got a red color and they got a coarser grain to them. So I think they experimented with that material. But I think the best way to identify a Hibbard basket, a Hibbard basket probably made in 1867, probably didn't look a lot different than a Hibbard basket made in 1935. So if you have some photographs of a basket or some examples, that'd be the best way. Because, they were selling a mass-produced product at the time. They weren't, serial and didn't have serial numbers, and they weren't, retail selling. They weren't Longaberger baskets. No, these were utilitarian baskets made to last, and produced in large quantities, as large as they can sell. So, thank you again. I'll answer some more questions. Come up and don't look at these. Don't look at these.